Welcome to Live Daf, your online Daf Yomi Shir.
Shalom and welcome back to today's Daf Yomi Shabbos Daf Ayin Tes. We're 7 lines from the top. Says the Gemara, Oyer Kedei Lasis Kamiyah. What is the minimum measurement of a piece of leather with regard to Haitzah to Rishus Rabim on Shabbos? If it has the sufficient amount to encase an amulet, a Kamiyah. Boiminei Rav Rav Nachman. Rav asked the following question of Rav Nachman: How might see oil become? What is the minimum measurement for carrying out leather into Rishus Rabim? Now, the Gemara later will explain we're speaking about partially processed leather. So, what is the shear of this leather for the Malach of Eitzah? Amalek Kedisnan, as we learned in our Mishnah. Oyer Kedei Lasis Kamiyah. Now, as Rashi points out, this was a lead question. It was just trying to lead up to the next questions that he was going to ask him. So this was an obvious question and answer. The halacha contained in our Mishnah. The shear of oyer is kedei lasis kamiyah, sufficient to make an amulet, to encase a kamiyah with it. Hama'abdei bekama. If one actually processes leather, he tans it, he does the malacha of ibud. What is the minimum measurement? What is the size requirement for that malacha? Amalei leishna. There's no difference. Meaning the same concept applied to the malacha of Eitzah, the measurement of Kedei Lasis Kamiyah, that applies to the malacha of Ma'abed as well. If he processes a piece of leather that contains these dimensions, he is chayiv for the malacha of Ma'abed. He continued asking him, La'avdoi bekama. What if this oyer, this leather, is totally unprocessed, but it is destined in the future to be processed? So what if he carries a piece of leather of this nature into Rishus Rabim? Perhaps it's not so significant as processed leather, and perhaps more is required. Amalei loishna, there's no difference. Whether processed or unprocessed, they both have the identical shear, which is Kedei Lasis Kamiyah. U'minatemer, how do you know to equate the two? Perhaps one can draw a distinction. Perhaps unprocessed leather requires more to be regarded as choshev, as significant. So he said Kedisnan, as we learned in the Mishnah, with regard to a different context. Other malachis, hamalabein, if one washes wool, vamanapetz, he combs it, he dyes it, he spins it. How much does he need to do for it to be considered a malacha? Shi'urai kimaloi roichav asit kafel. He needs to fill the roichav asit double. Roichav asit means distance between the index finger and the middle finger. That's roichav asit. Kafel means this distance doubled. So if one, for instance, he dyes some wool fibers which contain this distance, the roichav asit kafel, as long as this thing from this finger to this finger double, so that is the shear that is sufficient for the malacha of tzeveya, and malabin, and manapitz, and toive. The oireg beis chutin. If one actually weaves 2 threads, what is the shear for that? Shi'uroi, once again, kimloi roichav asid kafel. So this concept of roichav asid kafel, this shear, is applicable to weaving, to spinning, and the other malachas listed here. Alma, he says, apparently, kiven de l'tviyakoi, since when one performs the malach of malabin, he washes, he combs, he dyes. Why is he doing it? It's anticipation. It's as a preparation for the tviyah, for spinning these fibers into threads. So Alma, apparently we see that the two things are related. Kivan de tviyakoi, since the malachas of malabin and manapitz, etc., are done as a preparation, in anticipation for tviyah, for spinning. Shi'ura ketavui. Therefore, we see that the shear is identical to tviyah, to actually spinning. So we see that two things are related. If the shear of tviyah, the shear of tavui, is a thread which carries this shear of malay roichav asid kafel, so subsequently all malachis which lead up to tviyah, lead up to spinning, which are done as a preparation for the spinning, also contain the same shear. This is regarded as a significant amount, a significant shear, and constitutes a malacha. So we see that two things are very much connected. If this is a shear significant for Tviyah, it is a shear significant for the other malachas which are leading up to Tviyah. You are preparing this fiber, this material, this thread, which can yield a significant, an important product, importantly sized product. The shear of Leicha Recha Masid Kafel of spun wool, therefore, it is regarded as significant for the other malachas as well. Says Rav Nachman, going to apply the same concept to leather. Hachanam here too. Kivan de le'abdei koi. Since this leather, even though it's totally unprocessed, but what's its destiny? What's its intended? What is it intended for? Le'abdei koi. It's destined to get processed, to get tanned. Therefore, it has the same shear as processed leather. Shi'uroi kimubad. Because if this shear, again we're referring to the shear of Kedei Lasis Kamiyah, is considered significant with regard to a tanned piece of leather, says Rav Nachman, we're going to apply the same shear to an unprocessed piece of leather. If one is moitzi, carries out a piece of leather, an unprocessed piece of leather which contains this dimension, the dimension of Kedei Lasis Kamiyah, this too is regarded as significant. A significant chayfet, since when it will be processed, it will yield this important, significant product, a processed piece of leather, the size of Kedei Kamiyah. So if Nachman equates the two, he says the shiurim of processed and unprocessed are identical. Okay, continues the Gemara. Rava asked him another question. What if this leather is not destined, it doesn't stand to be processed? Now, what is going to be the shear for haitzah of this leather? Amar lei. So once again, Rav Nachman responds, Lo yishna, it makes no difference. It's irrelevant. Theoretically, it could be processed. It can yield an importantly sized product. Therefore, this size, this dimension has significance, and he is chayiv on the malacha haitzah. So he asked him 4 questions. He asked him, what is the shear of haitzah on processed, on unprocessed? What is the shear of processing, the ibud? And finally, what if the unprocessed leather is not destined to be processed? And on all 4 things, he gave the same answer. The shear is Kedei Lasis Kamiyah. Says the Gemara, how can you say there is no difference between processed leather and unprocessed leather? They both have the identical shear of Kedei Lasis Kamiyah. So Rabbi asked him a kasha. We find, perhaps otherwise, we find a halacha which seems to indicate that there is room to differentiate between the 2 things. We learned the halacha hamoitzi samon and shruyin. If one carries out samana, these are these herbs for use in the dyeing and the coloring process. So these samana, these herbs are already soaked. So he goes and he carries some of these herbs out in Shusarabim. What is the shear? Kedei litzboya ben, sufficient amount, quantity to use them to dye. Dugma, a small piece of material which is used as a sample. The person who dyes it, the tzaba, will use this as a sample to display to his customers. Le'ira, it's the same shape, the same size, the same shiur, Rashi says, of the ira, which is the piece of material needed for the weaver, which he uses to close up the opening in his tube that contains the threads. So it's one of these 2 things, either the size of dugma or size of ira. That is the shear of haitzah of samon and shirin, sufficient enough to dye this small piece of material. Okay, so that's one halach. V'ilu b'samon and she'eina shruyin. However, with regard to herbs that were not yet soaked, so these herbs used for dyeing, which were not yet soaked, Tanan, we learned in the Mishnah, a different shear. Klipi hagoyzim, one carries the klipa lacha, Rashi says, a thin skin on the shal klipe ha'egoyz, some of the skins of the a particular type of skin of the egoids, which is used for dyeing, the klipe rimoinim, pomegranate peels, stis. This is a herb used for blue dyeing, upua for red dyeing. So what is the shear if one carries these items out? So they're unprocessed as of yet, they're unsoaked. He needs to carry out sufficient amount which will allow him to dye a small beged lefi svacha. This is a small piece of material placed in the on top in the middle of the of her head covering. So this seems to be a larger shear, Rashi says, than the shear of the dugma and the ira related to the processed dyes. So apparently, when something is yet unprocessed, it contains less significant, less chashivas. We need a larger quantity in order for it to be considered significant enough for the Melacha Veitzah. So we see clearly that we do make that distinction, that differentiation between processed and unprocessed. Says the Gemara here as well regarding leather. How can you equate processed and unprocessed leather? Says the Gemara, Ha'itmar Allah. But we have learned an explanation on that halacha. Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rabbi Ravua. You know why there's a difference? A person does not trouble himself lishrois samanim to go and begin this process of soaking the dyes for just a small piece of material. It's boya behen a dugma leira. A person will not trouble himself to go through this process, this painstaking, arduous process of soaking those herbs, if he merely needs it for just this little bit of material, this dugma, this ira. Let's take a look at Rashi here. Rashi here is the first wide line in Rashi, in the middle of the wide line. She'ein adam tareach v'chul. Explains Rashi, a person will not trouble himself to get into this long and arduous process for just a small piece of material. V'im bo lishroisa. If he's already going to get involved in the process of dyeing and processing these dyes, soaking them, shoyre kedei pisvach. He's going to already soak and process the herbs, which will suffice for the pisvach, a larger amount. Once he's going to get into it, he's going to use it for more than just a simple sample. Therefore, we find that this distinction with regard to Melacha Veitzah, that if it's samanim which are shruyim, which are already soaked, then in that case he doesn't need to begin the process. He's simply taking ready-made dyes. In that case, even a small portion is suitable, is significant. But in the case where he needs to begin the process, he needs to take these unsoaked dyes and begin the process of dyeing them. In that case, we need a larger quantity for it to be worthwhile for him, and therefore the shear given is a larger shear. Continues Rashi. Avol oyer, but when it comes to oyer, to leather, terech adam la'abed kedei kamiyah, a person will trouble himself to process, to tan even a small piece of leather sufficient for the kamiyah, for the encasement of the amulet. And therefore, Rav Nachman responds and says, when it comes to oyer, we don't differentiate. Oyer leather doesn't require such an arduous, painstaking procedure, and therefore a person will not hesitate to even process a small piece of leather, and therefore even unprocessed leather, which carries the dimension of kedei alas's kamiyah, is regarded as significant, and if he carries it on Shabbos, he's chayv. Continues Rashi, umu'ubad nami, and the same thing regarding processed leather. Pachos midei kamiyah lo chashiv. If it's too small, not suitable for the amulet, it is not significant. Therefore, processed and unprocessed have the same identical shear. Continues the Gemara, v'arei roy negina. So Rav again challenged Rav Nachman. He says, I'm going to find another example where we find a distinction between processed and unprocessed. When it comes to zeiroi negina, he sees the garden seeds. The mekame dizarinu, prior to planting them, when they were merely seeds, Tanami learned in the Mishnah. Zeiroi negina pachis mikor geres. If one carries out into Sravim the garden seeds, what is the shear of Eitzah? Pachis mikor geres, less than the volume of a dried fig. This is the shear of Tanakama. Reviewed, you don't even need that much. Chamisha, merely 5 seeds are sufficient. V'ilu basa dezarinu. However, after the seed has already been planted, Tanan we learned in the Mishnah, what is regarded as significant, as chashiv, even a single one, even a single plant, zevel v'cheladak, if one carries out zevel manure v'cheladak, thin, fine sand, what is the shear of these items for Hitzah? Kedei l'zavel boy kelach shel kruv, amount sufficient to l'zavel boy to fertilize with it a kelach shel kruv, one stalk of cabbage. In order to fertilize one leak. So apparently even one has significance. So why does the Mishnah tell us earlier, when it comes to the actual seeds, it is not significant until it's either close to a gergeris or at least 5. Apparently one seed which can produce a single plant is not significant. It must be, the reason is because it's unprocessed. It hasn't yet been planted. Whereas the second Mishnah is talking about fertilizing a kruv, a kreisha which was already there, it's already planted. And therefore even one has significance. Apparently something which is unprocessed needs a larger quantity to be considered significant. So once again, Rav Nachman responded, Ha'itmar Allah, but we learned a pshat on this Mishnah. Amar Papa, Ha'dezariya. The second Mishnah is discussing something which was already planted. Ha'deloizariya. The first Mishnah is discussing unplanted seeds. And the difference is very simple. Levishain Adam Tzurech. A person will not trouble himself to carry out one seed, Lizriya, to go and plant it. He won't get involved in this lengthy, arduous process of planting his vegetables if he's only intending on doing one. So he won't carry out one seed for planting. But if it's already planted, if it's already growing, then certainly one has chashivas, one has significance. And that explains the second Mishnah, that when it comes to fertilizing, the fertilization is sufficient for one plant is sufficient. So that's the distinction given by Zriya. Planting is a cumbersome process. A person will not do it for just a single one. So he won't carry out the seed if it hadn't yet been planted. Once again, in contrast to tanning leather, to processing oil, well, yes, a person will trouble himself to process even a small piece of leather which has the dimension of lasis kamiyah. Therefore, Rav Nachman contends that there's no difference between processed and unprocessed leather. Either way, the share of significance is kedei lasis kamiyah. Even unprocessed leather has significance because the person will trouble himself to process, to tan even a piece of leather of that size. Says Gemara another kasha. We find a distinction by tit, by clay, by cement as well, by tit. The mekame deligbele, prior to mixing it, to kneading it, we find Tanya, the Brisa tells us, Moedim chacham l'Reb Shimon, chacham agree, they acquiesce to Reb Shimon, but moitzi sheifel l'shus harabim. So this is the Gemara we had yesterday. If one carries wastewater to shus harabim, what is the shear? Sheshiura and berevis. The shear of the wastewater is a revius. But we ask, what purpose does the wastewater serve? We use it to mix the tit, the clay, the cement. So we need this large amount of water, this revius, which will produce a large amount of clay in order for the water to be significant. But after it's been already mixed up, the tit, the clay, the cement has already been produced. Tani, we learned in the Brisa. So what is the shear of Haitzah on ready-made tit? K'dei lasis ben pikur. A small amount of tit sufficient to fashion the opening of the core of this smelting pot. They used to make this little hole there to use it to blow wind in there and to aid in the refining process. So he makes this little opening there with the tit. It's a very small amount of tit. So why this difference? Why, when it comes to ready-made tit, we say even a small portion is considered to be significant? In contrast to the halacha of the shoifchen, where we require a large amount, which can produce a larger amount of tit. So apparently we see that processed is more significant than unprocessed. And therefore, when it's ready-made tit, even a small measure is significant. But when you need to produce that tit, it's as of yet unprocessed. A much larger amount is required to have chashivas. Says Rav Nachman there too, Hasam Nami, Kedamaran, as we said earlier, Vishain Adam Tereach, Legablas Hatit. A person will not trouble himself to begin this process of mixing the clay lasis by pikur, to use it merely for this small function, this minor function of the pikur. Therefore, only if it's already ready-made clay, then we say that a small amount of tit is sufficient, is deemed significant. But if it's yet to be processed, yet to be produced, then we say a person will not begin the process, will not bother getting involved in producing tit for a very small amount, and therefore require the revius, which can produce a larger amount of clay. But in contrast, once again, to leather, as in our sugya, a person will trouble himself to tan and to process even a smaller piece of leather, even leather which has a dimension of kedeilas kamiyah. Therefore, once again, Rav Nachman contends the shear of both types of leather, processed and unprocessed, are identical. Tashma, come in here. The Amar of Chia bar Ami mishmei deula. He said the halacha in the name of Ula. Shloisha oiris ein. There are three types of leathers: matzah, v'chifa, v'diftara. So these represent three different stages in the development of the leather, as the Gemara will explain. The first thing was matzah. Matzah kemashmai. As it sounds, matzah is unprocessed bread, and this reflects the unprocessed state of the oil of the leather. It has undergone no processing. Deloi maliach. It hasn't yet been salted. They used to salt it to dry it up. Veloi kamiach. It hasn't yet been put into the solution of the flour solution, which smooths the leather, enables the writing on it. But deloi afetz. It hasn't yet been processed with the gall nuts. So this was the gall nuts was there for to benefit the leather, to allow the writing on it to stick, to hold. So these are three stages in the processing of leather. So we have three different stages here. We have matzah, which has nothing to it. It's raw leather. The kamashur, what is the shear of this type of leather, this totally unprocessed leather, with regard to haitzah of Shabbos? How much is significant? Tani or Shmuel Rav Yehuda, could they lotzer by, in order to wrap with it, mishkoilas tana, a small weight. A small weight, Rashi says, of lead, which would rub out, so they would cover it with a piece of leather to safeguard it. The kama, what size weight are we speaking about? Amrabaye riva de pumpadisa. A weight called riva de riva, Rashi says a riva of a litra of the city of Pumbedisa. So this is the size of the weight, and that's how much leather you need in order to wrap this weight. Now, this shear of Kedei Lotzu by Mishkoilas Tana is actually larger than the shear and the dimension of Kedei Lasses Kamiyah. So this is the first stage. Unprocessed leather needs a large shear. Continues the Gemara, the next stage, Chipa. This was the next stage leather, which already underwent some minimal processing. The maliach has been treated with salt, but nothing else. V'dolei kamiach or dolei afetz. V'kamashi uray. What is the share of significance for this type of leather when it comes to haitzah on Shabbos? Because it's not, as we learned, oyer, leather which is partially processed. Kedei las is kamiyah. In order to fashion from it a kamiyah, an amulet. So this is a smaller shear than the previous shear. Since this leather has been partially processed, it's more significant, it's more chashiv, and only needs a smaller shear of Kedei Lasses kamiyah. Diftara. This is the leather which was brought up to the next stage. The moliach has been salted, the kamiach has been treated with flour, with loyafets, but not yet treated with the gallstones, gall nuts. So this diftara is suitable to write on it. It's not yet fully completed, but it is somewhat more advanced than the other forms of leather. V'kama shi'uroi. What is the shear of this type of leather? If you have a sufficient piece of diftara, which is large enough to write a get on it, Rashi explains we're speaking about just the minimum size get. His name, her name, the Edom, the Zman, a very short form get. So if the diftara has this allowance, that is regarded as significant and is the shear of Eitzah on Shabbos. Says the Gemara, Katan Miyas. In any rate, it says, it gives us the difference, a distinction between processed and unprocessed. The unprocessed leather, the first stage, the matzah leather, it needs a larger amount, enough to wrap the mishkoilas. Riva de pumbedisa, this weight of pumbedisa. And this is a larger shear than the shear attributed to the next level of leather, which merely needs kedei lasis kamiyah. So apparently there's a difference between processed, which only needs kedei lasis kamiyah, and unprocessed leather, which requires more, because it's not so significant, it's not so chashav, it needs more. It needs a larger volume, a greater amount for Itzah Shabbos. This is a kasha of Rav Nachman, who equated the two. Says the Gemara, Hasam b'vishula. That discussion, this distinction between processed and unprocessed, where we learned that unprocessed leather needs a larger amount, we're speaking about leather which is fresh off the animal, b'vishula. It's Rashi says it's lach, it's still moist. And we use the term bishul. It's like a cooked item. It's wet. It's moist. It's not yet dried up. It's not yet roi. It's not suitable for processing. In that case, we can't give it the same shear as we do to processed leather. It's in its own class, and therefore, since it's not yet destined, it's not yet standing for ibud, for processing. It has its own din, has its own shear, and it needs more for it to be regarded as significant. It needs to have the dimension which allows it to wrap a weight with it. That is considered to be its current function, its current use. It's not yet connected to the process of tanning, of ibud. Therefore it has its own share. Once again, Hassam, this larger amount, is speaking about leather which is bibishula, is speaking about a leather which is yet fresh and unsuitable for processing. Says in 1 second, we have another kasha about Tanan, haven't we learned in the Mishnah? Ha-beged, what is the minimum dimension of a beged, of a piece of material? Shloisha midras. In order to become tummy to midras, which is where the zav would sit on it, even without coming into direct contact, he is metamid, this beged becomes a stringent form of tumah, avatuma. So if we have a large size material which is 3 tfachim long by 3 tfachim wide, that is sufficient for tumas medras, as Rashi points out, as opposed to other tumais, where we don't need such a large size material. Even 3 etzbois by 3 etzbois is sufficient. But for tumas medras, that requires a larger shear. It's meant to be suitable for sitting on it. So we need 3 tfachim by 3 tfachim. The Mishnah continues. So that's regarding material. What about sak? This is made of goat's hair, which is more coarse. So that needs a larger size. It's dal, 4 tfachim by 4 tfachim. Ha'oir, leather. Heyal hey. 5 tfachim by 5 tfachim. Mapats, this is a mat. Vav, 6 by 6. Bein lemedras, these shiurim, these dimensions apply to tumas medras. Bein lemeis also apply to tumas meis. These are minimum requirements, referring of course to the sak, the and the mapats. These shiurim are applicable to all types of tumas, midras, and meis. V'tani Allah, and we have a brayz that we learned, which comes to explain this halacha. Ha-beged v'hasak v'ha'oir k'shir l'tumah, just as we provided these shiurim, which with regard to tumah, kach shir lo'itzah, the same shiurim, the same dimensions are applied to the malacha v'Itzah Shabbos. Now, what does the Brisa tell us? What does the Mishnah tell us? The shear of oir for Itzah Shabbos is 5 by 5 tfachim. This is a very large size piece of leather. How is this compatible with this sugya? With the sugya, we learned that when we have the shear of leather, of processed leather, which is kedei lasis kamiyah, and here we have another shear of 5 by 5 tfachim. Apparently, the difference is very simple. We're speaking about unprocessed leather. Unprocessed leather needs a very, very large size. This is a kasha on Rav Nachman, who tells us that both processed and unprocessed have the identical shear. Says the Gemara, Hahu, Bikur Tuvla, that leather that is listed in the Mishnah and Kalim is speaking about leather which was already cooked and hardened and is unfit for any other function other than being used as a mat, as a rug. It's meant to sit on it. So, or it says to sit on it or to use it to as a covering for something. So in this case, it's not ordinary leather, and therefore it has its own shear of 5 by 5 tfachim. Only if it contains that dimension is it suitable for its function. However, in our case, in our sugya, in our Mishnah, we're speaking about leather which is pliable, which is soft, which can serve ordinary functions, and therefore, yes, says Rav Nachman, we're meant to equate processed and unprocessed leather. They both have the shear of Kedei Lashes Kamiyah, except for this Bishula mentioned earlier, this moist leather which has a class of its own, and in that case, we need an amount which can wrap the weight. So in summary, we learned the halacha of Hamoitzi Or, and the Gemara concluded with 5 categories of different types of leather which have their respective shiurim, which denote their significance when it comes to Haitza'as Shabbos. We have the hard leather, the Kurtuvla, which requires 5 tfachim by 5 tfachim. We have the moist leather, the Bishula, which is not yet suitable for processing. In that case, it is only significant if it has the dimension of Kedei Lotzur Mishkoilach Tana, to wrap with a small weight. We have the leather which is not yet processed. It's not moist, it's already been dried up, but not yet processed at all. It's called matzah. In that case, even a smaller shear is significant. Kedei Lashes Kamiyah, to fashion from it an amulet. We have the oil which has been partially processed, muliach, been treated with salt, that's called chifa. There too, the shear is Kedei Lashes Kamiyah. As Rav Nachman tells us, processed and unprocessed leather both contain the same shear of Kedei Lashes Kamiyah. What if the leather has been further processed, maliach and kamiyach, which is the treatment of the flour treatment, that's called diftera. It is suitable to be written on, and the shear over there for Haitza'as Shabbos is if it has the measurement Kedei Lichtav B'Elav Saget, to write on it a get. Now what about leather which has been fully processed, maliach, kamiyach, and afitz, treated with these gall nuts? That is no longer regarded as as leather. That's called klaf, parchment. What is the shear of parchment? The Mishnah tells us klaf is if it's large enough to write on it these small parsha of tefillin, which is the Shema up until Uchsavtam al Mezuzis Besecha V'Sharecha, as we will see in the upcoming Gemara. It says the Gemara klaf K'dei Lichtav Alav Parsha Ktana. V'raminu, we have a steer from our Bryce. Klaf v'duch sustus K'dei Lichtav Alav Mezuzah. Now, in order for us to properly understand the upcoming Gemara describing different forms of parchment, perhaps let's stop for a short introduction here. So this fully processed leather, this parchment, apparently it was thick, and they used to go ahead and they used to split it along its thickness. They used to splice it into 2 separate pieces of parchment. The top portion was called klaf. The bottom was called duch sustus. Taisa says duch sustus is a combination, a combo word. Duch in Greek, in Lashon Yavin, means place, and sustus means flesh, basar. So the bottom portion of the parchment was the one actually sitting on the flesh. Therefore, it's called duch sustus, the place of the basar. So duch is the place, sustus is the basar. Now we're going to learn that tefillin are meant to be written on the klaf. So this is the upper portion of the parchment, and mezuzah is meant to be written on the duch sustus. Both parts together comprise something called gvil. This is the unspliced parchment, on which a sefer Torah can be written on. Now, tefillin are written on klaf. On which side of the klaf? On the side which is facing the air, the makom seir, the side which contains the hair of the animal, or the lower side, the underside of the klaf, which is called the makom basar, since it's the side which is facing the flesh of the animal. So tefillin are meant to be written on the underside of the klaf, on the klaf b'makom basar. On the other hand, we have mezuzah, which is meant to be written on duch sustus, which is the lower half of this parchment, but on which side of the duch sustus? So the lower side is called makom basar, it's the side which was facing the flesh, and the upper side is called the makom seir, which is it's facing outward, it's facing up to the area of the hair. So indeed, that is the surface which a mezuzah is meant to be written on the duch sustus, b'makom seir, on the side of the duch sustus which is facing the hair, away from the animal. So this is a short introduction to the upcoming Gemara. Once again, tefillin meant to be written on the klaf, which is the upper portion of this parchment, is meant to be written on the underside of that klaf. Duch sustus is meant for mezuzah, which is the lower portion of this parchment. On which side of the zustus? On the upper side, on the side which is facing away from the flesh of the animal. Let's see the Gemara again. Let's start from the beginning. Klaf, the Mishnah told us that parchment, which has a dimension, kedei lichtavel of parsha ktana of tefillin, it's small enough, it's large enough, it's very small, but it's large enough to write on it the small parsha of Shema up until Uvisharecha, which is the smallest parsha of tefillin. That is deemed significant enough for the Mlach Veitzah. V'raminu, we have a brayso which tells us otherwise. Klaf v'duch sustus, kedei lichtavel of mezuzah. It needs to be large enough to write on a mezuzah. Mezuzah contains both parshas, Shema and Vayim Shemaya, which is larger, requires more space than the parsha Ktana of Tefillin, which is merely Shema until Avisharecha, which is only one parsha. So we have a steer here between the Mishnah, which requires a smaller amount of klaf, and the brayso, which seems to indicate we need a larger size klaf, sufficient to write a mezuzah. Says Gemara, my mezuzah? What does it mean? What does the term mezuzah mean? Mezuzah should be tefillin. It's not referring to a mezuzah placed on a doorpost, but rather the parsha of the tefillin, the smallest parsha, and indeed it's compatible with the Mishnah. Says the Gemara, v'karlu l'tefillin mezuzah? Is that the way to relate to a parsha of tefillin? We call it mezuzah? In yes, v'atanya, as we learned in the brayso, ritzuois tefillin ima tefillin. Metamas seidayim. We know the Chachamim applied a tumah with regard to truma. We learned this in Daf Yudalid, that the Chacham were concerned that there was this practice to place the food, the truma, next to the tefillin, and the mice would come, eat the food, and damage the tefillin. So the Chacham said that if one touches the tefillin with his hands become a sheni l'tuma, pertaining to truma. So if he touches truma, he's metame the truma. So if he touches those tefillin, hands become tummy. Now what about the straps? Are the straps regarded as part of the tefillin? When it comes to this takana, this gzera, says the brayso, ritzuas tefillin ima tefillin. If they're connected, yes, metamas seidayim, then they're regarded as part of the tefillin, and they too are metame deidayim. Not only if he touches the actual tefillin, but also the ritzua is metame. But if they're independent, they're not connected to the tefillin, ein metamas seidayim, then they're not metame the hands. Reb Shimon ben Yehuda Omer, Mishum Reb Shimon, he's actually more lenient. Hanegeb ritzua tar. If he touches the ritzua itself, the strap, he's tar. Ad sheyiga b'ktzitza, until he actually touches the box of the tefillin. Reb Zakkai Mishmoy Omer, Reb Zakkai says the name of Shimon, even more lenient. Tar, he's tar ad sheyiga b'mezuzah atzma, until he touches the actual parchment. So you have three shittas. We have the first shita which says the straps are metame as long as they're connected to the tefillin. The next shita which says straps are never metame. The third shita says the only thing that's metame is the mezuzah atzma, the parchment itself, the parsha in the tefillin. So you see that the term mezuzah relates to a parsha in the tefillin. So indeed, that explains the earlier price. Klaf v'dechsustus k'tei lichtalav mezuzah. It's simply referring to the parsha of tefillin. And indeed, it's aligned with the shir of our Mishnah. Says the Gemara, but it can't work. If we'll take a look at the latter part of that brayso, which we begun with, the klaf v'duch sustus, they lichtal of mezuzah. If you'll drop down to the lower portion of the brayso, what does it say there? Klaf, they lichtal of pasha talan shemitfilin. What is the shir of Hoitzah Shabbos when it comes to parchment, klaf, which again is the upper portion of the parchment? The shir is k'dei lichtav alav parsha ktana shebetfilin. In order to write on it a small parsha of tefillin sheishma Yisrael. So if the brayso elaborates on klaf as it pertains to the shema of the tefillin, mechlal the reisha, apparently the first part of the brayso b'mezuzah atzma askinan. The second part of the brayso already explains to us, already gives us the shir of klaf as it pertains to this small parsha of tefillin. Apparently, the opening portion of the brayso, which says "Klav v'duch sustus," k'tei lichtav olav mezuzah, is telling us a different halach, a different shir, a shir of mezuzah atzma. That klav v'duch sustus need to contain an area sufficient to write a mezuzah. It can't be that mezuzah here is referring to tefillin. That's already explained. That's already stated in the second portion of the brayso. Apparently, mezuzah really means literally mezuzah. Now, mezuzah it contains both parshas, Shema and Shemaya. It's larger than the parsha ktana shebetfilin. So we have a contradiction, a stira. The Brisa tells us that the shear of klaf needs to be large enough for mezuzah. It's incompatible with our Mishnah, which tells us that klaf needs to be smaller. Even if it only has the space to write a small parsha of tefillin, which is one parsha, is sufficient. Says the Gemara, this is what the Brisa means to say. The Brisa begins by giving us an opening statement. Klaf v'duchsustus, both forms of parchment, the klaf and the duchsustus, shiur and bekam. What is the shiur regarding Hotzel Shabbos? So it's an opening statement. Klaf v'duchsustus, what is their shiur? And the Brisa continues to elaborate. Duchsustus, k'nei lichtav mezuzah. What is the shiur of duchsustus? Since it is meant to have a mezuzah written on it. So indeed, what is the minimum measurement for the duchsustus for Shabbos? The size required to write on it a mezuzah, which is a larger size, because it's intended for mezuzah. Klaf, what is the shiur of klaf, which is the upper portion of the parchment, which is intended for tefillin? Over there we follow the shiur of tefillin. So indeed this Brisa is fully compatible with our Mishnah. The Brisa begins by saying klaf v'duchsustus. What is the shiur for Hotzel Shabbos when it comes to klaf or duchsustus? The answer is duchsustus is connected with mezuzah, therefore needs to be large enough to write on it the entire mezuzah. What is the shiur of klaf? That's intended for tefillin, therefore a smaller measure is sufficient, the amount necessary to write on it the smallest parsha of tefillin. Continues the Gemara, Amarav, duchsustus harei keklaf. So even though ideally tefillin are meant to be written on klaf and mezuzah on duchsustus, however, says Rav, b'di'evet, they both have the same halacha. Duchsustus is like klaf. What does he mean to say? Ma klaf, koisen olav tefillin. Just as tefillin can be written on klaf, after duchsustus, koisen olav tefillin. Tefillin can be written on duchsustus as well. So if he switches things around, it's still kosher. Says the Gemara, Tanan, we learned in our Mishnah, klaf. What is the minimum measurement of klaf for Hotzel Shabbos? What is regarded as a significant piece of klaf if it's suitable for the purpose for which it's intended for? Says the Gemara, klaf in. This shiur is regarded as the minimum for klaf since it's intended for tefillin. But duchsustus loy. However, duchsustus doesn't have the same shiur because duchsustus is not intended for tefillin. It's intended for mezuzah. Therefore, it requires a larger measure, a larger amount, suitable for mezuzah. So apparently, tefillin are not meant to be written on duchsustus. And this is a kasha on Rav. It says more mitzvah. We're speaking about the ideal way of writing down the tefillin. And indeed, the tefillin are meant to be written on klaf. Let's take a look at Rashi. Rashi here is just about in the middle of the Amud. It's around 19 or 20 lines from the top. Rashi begins with the word lemitzvah. Explains Rashi the Gemara. Lemitzvah mitzvah min hamufchar klaf bina. Certainly initially, in order to do a mitzvah properly, mitzvah min hamufchar, in the most preferred manner, certainly all agree that we require klaf at tefillin. Therefore explains Rashi, Ustama dechol inish. We can assume that every person, mitzvah ma'al yisavid, a person is trying to do a mitzvah in the most preferred manner, he's going to write his tefillin on klaf, l'chatchila, the way it's meant to be. Hilkach, says Rashi, therefore, lo yimatzna duchsustus lo tefillin. He's not going to retain, to store duchsustus for tefillin. V'havle ein matznin kamayu. Therefore, this is regarded as something which is a type of thing which is not stored for this purpose. Therefore, since it's not intended, ideally it's not intended for tefillin, the duchsustus is meant for mezuzah. Therefore, carrying out a small piece of the duchsustus, which is sufficient to write on it a small parsha of tefillin, is regarded as something unsuitable, something which is ein matznin kamayu, something which is not regarded as something significant. One doesn't store it for this purpose. And therefore, if he carries out a small piece of the duchsustus, which can be used for the parsha Kaddish with tefillin. It's not regarded as chasha, as significant. It's not really meant for that. A person doesn't keep his duchsustus for his tefillin, therefore has no chashivas in that regard, and it is not regarded as a malacha beitzah. So once again, although Rav maintains that if one should write his tefillin on duchsustus, it's kosher, But nevertheless, when it comes to Malacha Beitzah, we don't regard the chsustas as something suitable for tefillin. Continues the Gemara Tashma. Halacha l'Moshe Sinai, tefillin ala klaf. So there's halacha received by Moshe from Sinai that tefillin are meant to be written on the klaf. Umezuzah chsustas. Now, which side of the klaf are tefillin meant to be written? Which side of the chsustas is the mezuzah meant to be written on? Says the Bryce, klaf b'mokim basar. So tefillin are meant to be written on the klaf. On which side? On the mokim basar, on the lower portion, on the underside of the klaf, the side which is facing the flesh, which was facing the flesh when it was on the animal. The chsustas b'mokim seir. On which side of the chsustas is one meant to write the mezuzah? B'mokim seir. On the side of the chsustas which is facing outward, facing away from the flesh, facing the direction of the seir of the hair. So you see clearly that tefillin are meant to be written on klaf and not on the chsustas. This seems to be a kasha on Rav. That's more mitzvah. Certainly the Bryce is discussing the preferred manner, the mitzvah manner of doing it, the proper way of doing it. Certainly it's tefillin on klaf, but b'di'evet, if he were to switch it, perhaps it's kasha. V'atanya, but I haven't learned the Bryce. Shina puzzle. If he switched things around, he's puzzle. Says more mezuzah. That Bryce, which doesn't allow you to switch things, is referring to mezuzah. So if he puts the mezuzah on the klaf, certainly it's puzzle. However, the tefillin on the chsustas is kasha. V'atanya. But I haven't learned in a different Bryce. Shina bazeh ubazeh puzzle. If you switch both around, they're both puzzle. This implies that in both cases, mezuzah and tefillin, any deviation invalidates. So it's more idi on mezuzah. Both are referring to mezuzah. The Bryce which says shina bazeh ubazeh is puzzle is referring to a deviation of mezuzah. Two forms of deviation. The first case is referring to the chasvinu aklaf makam seir. If he takes the mezuzah, instead of writing it on the chsustas, he writes it onto the klaf. Even if he should write it on the proper side of the klaf, meaning the side facing outward, facing the seir, which is the right direction on which a mezuzah is meant to be recorded, because once again, a mezuzah is on the chsustas b'makayim seir, on the side of the chsustas facing outward, facing the hair. So even if he should write the mezuzah on the proper side of the parchment, but he uses the wrong parchment, he writes it on the klaf. In that case, it's pasla. Certainly, if he writes it on the underside of the klaf, which is the mokim bas of the klaf. So that's the first case. Shina bazeh, one type of deviation is writing on the wrong type of parchment. Inami. Alternatively, adach sustas mokim basar. If he deviates by writing the mezuzah on the right material, on the sustas, but he writes it on the wrong side, on the side of the sustas, which is facing the flesh, that too invalidates the mezuzah. So when the Brisa says shina bezeh ubezeh, it's referring to two types of deviation of mezuzah. However, a deviation by tefillin is kosher. If you should write the tefillin on the sustas instead of klaf, perhaps that would be kosher. We have another pshat. Shina bezeh ubezeh, this Brisa which maintains that any type of deviation, whether tefillin or mezuzah, wouldn't invalidate. Tanoi. It's actually based on machlokes Tanoi. This Sanya, shina bezeh ubezeh pasul. So any sort of change, whether it's tefillin on the sustas, whether it's mezuzah on klaf, it is possible. So this is one sheet. But Rav Acha, machshir mishum Rabbi Acha bar Chanina. So Rav Acha, the name of Rav Chanina, says it's kosher. A shina of tefillin is kosher. And indeed, this aligns with Rav, who tells us a shina of tefillin, if he should write the tefillin on the sustas, it would be kosher. Ve'amrila, some say mishum Rabbi Acha bar Chanina, that Rav Acha was actually quoting Rav Acha bar Chanina, that if he would switch around the tefillin and write it on the sustas, it would be kosher. So indeed, this halacha depends on these tanoim. Says the Gemara, Rav Papa Omar, Rav the Omar, we have another source for Rav's shita that writing tefillin on the sustas is kosher. The Tanad Ve'Menash, Kosval in a yor. If you wrote it on paper, valamatlas on a rag, plusula, it's possible. Ala klaf on parchment. Vala gvil, this is the complete parchment, unsplit. Valdach sustas, this is the lower part of the parchment. Kshera, it's kosher. Now, what did he write? What is he referring to? Kosva mai. What did he write? Ilema mezuzah. Are we speaking about mezuzah? It can't be. Mezuzah aklaf mikasvinan? Can one write a mezuzah on klaf? Nobody holds that a deviation by mezuzah is acceptable. Ella lav tefillin. The Brisa here must be referring to tefillin, and the Brisa tells us the writing tefillin on the sustas is also kosher. Indeed, this supports Rav's sheet. Says the Gemara, according to you, tefillin agvil mikasvina. The Brisa tells us that if he writes it on klaf, on the sustas, and on gvil as well, it's kosher. Certainly, you can't write tefillin on gvil. Ella, it says rather, Ketanya Ibe Sefer Torah. Apparently, this Bryce is discussing Sefer Torah, which can indeed be written on klaf, on gvil, and on the sustas, and it's unrelated to tefillin and unrelated to Rav. Continues the Gemara, Leimi Masayele. Perhaps we can make a right to Rav from the following Bryce. The Bryce is Meseches Menachos, which tells us a rule: one may only upgrade when it comes to matters of kedusha. For instance, he can turn his shal yad into a tefillin shal roish, because tefillin shal roish is on a higher level, because it contains both letters of the Shem Shakai, the Shin, and the Dal, which is formed in the Ritzuis on the back of his head, whereas the Shal Yad only has the Yud, so one can turn the Shal Yad into Shal Roish, but cannot downgrade the Tefillin Shal Roish into a Tefillin Shal Yad. Chayotzebe, a similar halacha. Tefillin Shabbalu, what about tefillin which became worn out, with Sefer Torah Shabbalu, or a worn out Sefer Torah, ein oisin mehem mezuzah. One cannot fashion from them a mezuzah. You can't extract the parshas needed for the mezuzah from the tefillin and Sefer Torah. Why? Because one may not downgrade from a higher level of sanctity to a lower level. You cannot turn a tefillin and Sefer Torah into a mezuzah. Apparently the reason is only because of this problem, this objection of downgrading. But if not for this objection, technically speaking, one can turn a tefillin or a Sefer Torah into a mezuzah. Now we know that a mezuzah needs to have dechsustas. Says the Gemara, these tefillin that we're going to use, dechsiva amai, what were these tefillin written on? Lav dechsiva dechsustas. Apparently, it was also written on dechsustas, and therefore, technically speaking, we would be able to take the parsha from the tefillin, which is dechsustas, and use it for mezuzah. We have a raya to Rav that tefillin may be written on dechsustas. Says the Gemara, no, dechsiva ala klaf. The tefillin was written on klaf, and the mezuzah can be kosher even if it's klaf. Says the Gemara, is that so? Mezuzah klaf mikasvina. Can one write a mezuzah on klaf? Yes, v'atani, as we learned, kosva ala klaf. If he wrote the mezuzah on klaf, ala niyar, on paper, on matlas, on a rag, psula, it's possible. Reb Shimon Elazar, Reb Meir, haya kosva ala klaf. He would specifically write a mezuzah on klaf, because it endures. Therefore, we see that there's a shita that allows mezuzah to be written on klaf. And indeed, that is a pshat in that brisa, which would theoretically allow a tefillin to become a mezuzah, because the tefillin was klaf, and the mezuzah can be written on klaf as well. Says the Gemara, now that you've come to this point, that mezuzah can also deviate, that instead of writing on the sustas, when we write it on klaf, it's also kosher. If so, let's rearrange Rav's sheet. Rav Nami, let's come up with another version of Rav's halach. The Rav Nami loitemi, don't say the Rav meant to say the sustas hareka klaf, that the sustas is like klaf, and the tefillin can be written on the sustas just as it can be written on klaf. Elaima rather say as follows: Rav was allowing a deviation by mezuzah, not by tefillin. Elaima says as follows: klaf harayu k'dechsustas. Klaf has the same din, same status as dechsustas, meaning ma dechsustas koisnol of mezuzah, just like a mezuzah can be written on dechsustas. Af klaf koisnol of mezuzah, a mezuzah can be written on klaf as well. So we have two versions of Rav. The initial version of Rav was that he allowed deviation by tefillin and not by mezuzah. The second version was, no, Rav allowed deviation by mezuzah and not by tefillin. So in summary, mitzvah min hamofcher l'chatchila, one is meant to write tefillin on klaf, mezuzah on dechsustas. We have two versions of Rav. According to the first version, Rav allowed deviation by tefillin, but the Yevid can write it on dechsustas as well. Mezuzah tolerates no deviation, as the Brisa tells us, Shina bezeh bezeh pasal. According to the second version of the Gemara, Rav allowed deviation by mezuzah. If he was to write the mezuzah on klaf, it is also kosher. Tefillin must remain on a klaf, and according with the Brisa, which tells us Shina bezeh bezeh pasal, which as Tosfos explains is referring to the tefillin on the klaf. Okay, time for a brief chazara of today's daf. We began with the halacha of amoitzi or, and the Gemara gave us 5 categories of leather. Hard leather needs 5 tfachim by 5 tfachim. Moist leather needs an amount suitable to wrap the weight. Leather which is not moist but not yet processed, the shear over there is kedlas's kamiyah. What if it's already been partially processed maliach, treated with salt? That is also the shear of glasses kamiyah. What if it's more processed maliach v'kamiyach, suitable to write on it? The shear over there is lichta v'saget. What if it's fully processed? That's called klaf. The shear over there is lichta of parshak tanash b'tfilin. As the Gemara elaborated on these different forms of parchment, klaf has a shear of parshak tanash b'tfilin. The chsustas, which is the lower portion of the parchment, was suitable for mezuzah. The shear over there is to write a mezuzah on it. We conclude with the halacha of Rab, who tells us sometimes deviations are permitted b'di'evet. We have two versions, whether the deviation applies to tefillin and he's machshir tefillin on the chsustas as well, or the heter of Rab applies to mezuzah and he's machshir a mezuzah which was written on klaf.